There is a specific silence that hurts more than an argument. You felt it. Most people have. You sent the message. It was read. And then, nothing. An hour passed. Then a day. There was no rejection. Nobody told you no. Nobody said you were wrong or unwelcome or unloved. They just didn't respond. If you're being honest with yourself, the not responding hurt more than a hostile reply would have. You told yourself it shouldn't, that the silence was probably nothing, that you were reading into it, that healthy people don't spiral over a missing text message. Some of that was probably true. None of it made the feeling go away. Here is what most people don't know. That specific ache, the one that comes from being ignored, not from being rejected, has been the subject of neuroscience research for over 20 years. And what scientists have found is genuinely unsettling. Because being ignored, at the level of your nervous system, isn't a milder version of being rejected. It is worse. The story most of us carry about being ignored goes something like this. It's a mild version of rejection. Uncomfortable, sure. A little bruising to the ego. But nothing serious, nothing to actually be affected by. That story is wrong. Scientists call being ignored something specific. Ostracism. And ostracism is not a subset of rejection. It is its own category, with its own neurological signature, its own physiological effects, its own psychological consequences. And in some very specific ways, ostracism does more damage than direct rejection ever does. When someone rejects you outright, at least you know where you stand. You have information, you can process it, you can respond, argue back, adjust. When someone ignores you, you have nothing. No information, no feedback, no ground to stand on. Your brain has to fill in what's happening. And what your brain fills in, uninterrupted, is always worse than the truth would have been. The person who put a name to this, and built a career studying it, was a psychologist at Purdue University named Kip Williams. Williams' interest in ostracism started with a personal experience. He was in a park. Two people were playing frisbee. The frisbee bounced off him. He tossed it back. They started throwing it back to him, and for a minute or two, he was included in what became a three-person game. Then, without warning, they stopped throwing it his way. He stood there, waiting to be included again. He wasn't. It went on for several minutes. Two strangers, in a park, deciding, with no visible reason, that he was no longer part of the game. He walked away feeling worse than he had any reason to feel, and he could not stop thinking about it. Williams started designing experiments. The most famous one is called Cyberball. It's a simple online ball-tossing game. A participant plays with two other players, who are actually computer programs. After a few rounds of normal play, the computer players stop throwing to the participant. Just stop. For the rest of the game, it's about as mild an experience of being ignored as you can construct in a laboratory. And the results, published beginning in the late 1990s, changed how psychologists think about social pain. Even that mild ostracism, by strangers in a game with a computer, produced measurable emotional distress, a drop in mood, a drop in self-reported well-being. In fMRI follow-ups, activation in the same brain regions that process physical pain. And then Williams' team ran variations that made the finding even harder to dismiss. The effect showed up even when participants were told the other players were computers, even when they were told the game was rigged, even when the players ignoring them belonged to a group the participant openly disliked. Being ignored still hurt, every time, without exception. What Williams and his collaborators found next was that being ignored isn't a single experience. It moves through stages. The first stage happens in the first few seconds. Your brain registers the exclusion before you've had time to process it consciously. There's a pain response, a drop in mood, a basic disruption of what psychologists call fundamental social needs: belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence. This stage is reflexive. Nobody escapes it. It doesn't matter how emotionally healthy you are, how much therapy you've had, how independent you consider yourself. Being ignored hurts. Reflexively. The second stage begins minutes to hours later. This is where your conscious mind takes over. You try to make sense of what's happening. You come up with explanations. You look for coping strategies. Some people reach out to other people they trust. Some people withdraw. Some people become angry and combative. The specific coping response varies, but everyone tries something. And then, if the ostracism continues, if the silence stretches for weeks or months, if you can't fix it and can't make it stop, you enter the third stage. Williams called it resignation. It looks like depression. It feels like disconnection from your own life. People in prolonged ostracism report feeling invisible, unworthy, and hollow. Some describe it as feeling like they don't quite exist. The nervous system, unable to solve the problem of the silence, eventually stops trying. It gives up. We now live in an environment optimized for this kind of injury. Every messaging app tells you when your message was read. Every social platform tells you who saw your post and didn't engage. Every relationship contains micro-signals of inclusion and exclusion that our ancestors never had to interpret. The ghosting, the disappearing without explanation, is a specifically modern injury. It is ostracism as a normalized behavior, something people do to each other casually, with the implicit understanding that no explanation is required, and it has consequences we are only beginning to measure. Research from the mid-2010s onward has documented that people who report being ghosted experience the same kind of distress pattern Williams first documented in the lab: reflexive pain, attempts to cope, and in prolonged cases, symptoms of depression and self-doubt that outlast the actual relationship by months. None of this is oversensitivity. It is a well-mapped neurological response to a specific kind of injury, one your ancestors would have experienced maybe a few times in their entire lives. You experience it several times a day, so think about that ache differently now. That silence that hurt more than you thought it should. The one you tried to talk yourself out of feeling. That wasn't oversensitivity, wasn't weakness, wasn't a sign that you need to be less attached to what other people think of you. It was a well-documented neurological pain response, produced by exactly the mechanism it evolved to signal. Your ancestors lived in groups of 150 people or fewer. Being ignored by that group wasn't an inconvenience. It was the beginning of being unable to survive. The people who felt no pain when they were being frozen out died before they could pass on their genes. The ones who felt intense, unignorable, disruptive pain when they were being ignored responded, repaired relationships, fixed what was breaking, stayed alive. You are the descendant of that second group. The ache you feel when someone reads your message and doesn't respond is not a bug in your emotional design. It is the very old feature that kept your species alive. The problem isn't that you feel it. The problem is that we now live in a world that produces it constantly and treats the feeling as embarrassing. So the next time someone doesn't respond, and it lands harder than you think it should, you don't need to talk yourself out of it. You don't need to be embarrassed by the intensity of what you're feeling. You don't need to be more evolved, more secure, less needy, more chill. You need to recognize what the ache actually is: an ancient system, doing exactly what it was built to do in a world it was never built for. The signal isn't broken. The environment is. And knowing that, really knowing it, is the closest thing to relief that neuroscience can offer. Because the ache is not evidence that you are too much. It is evidence that you are still here, still connected, still capable of being affected by other people. And in a world that increasingly treats disconnection as normal, that may be the most important thing about you.